My name is Ethan Mercer, and I never imagined that a quiet line of old cedar trees along my property would become the reason an entire neighborhood turned against itself. Those trees weren't just decoration. They blocked brutal seasonal winds, kept dust from rolling across the valley, and marked a boundary that had stood longer than most of the houses nearby. But one HOA president decided they were ruining the premium view from several luxury homes, and that was apparently enough reason to treat my land like it belonged to the association. What happened next honestly stunned me because this wasn't just about arrogance anymore. It became a chain reaction of entitlement, terrible decisions, and consequences nobody bothered to consider until it was far too late. Bro, the part that shocked me most wasn't that someone bulldozed private property. It was how confidently they believed nature would simply cooperate with their plans. They couldn't have been more wrong, and the fallout changed everything. When everything started, I honestly thought it was just another annoying disagreement between a rural property owner and a neighborhood HOA that had forgotten where its authority ended. I'd lived on my land for nearly 12 years, long before the upscale subdivision next door was built. My property wasn't part of their association, never had been, and every deed, survey, and county map made that crystal clear. The developers knew it. The county knew it. I knew it. The only people who seemed determined to ignore that fact were the HOA board members who had convinced themselves that expensive homes automatically came with the right to control whatever they could see from their back patios. That's exactly how entitlement grows in real life. It starts small, then someone with too much confidence decides the rules don't apply to them anymore. The cedar tree line stretched nearly 600 feet along the western edge of my property. Some of those trees were decades old, planted years before I bought the land as part of a conservation effort to stabilize the soil across the valley. They weren't random landscaping choices. Their deep roots held loose ground together during heavy rains, while their dense branches slowed the powerful winds that swept across open farmland every spring and summer. Every local farmer understood why those trees mattered. The county's environmental office had even referenced them in previous erosion studies. But the new residents didn't see any of that. All they saw was a wall of green blocking a panoramic sunset that real estate brochures had exaggerated long before construction even finished. The complaints started quietly. First came polite letters asking if I would consider selective trimming. Then there were suggestions about removing a few unattractive sections. Before long, the requests became demands disguised as neighborhood concerns. Apparently several homeowners believed their property values were suffering because they couldn't enjoy an uninterrupted mountain view. Every month seemed to bring another message from the HOA explaining how cooperation would benefit everyone. Funny how everyone always meant them while I was expected to absorb every cost. Bro, hearing that mindset still makes me shake my head because nobody once asked why those trees had been there for generations. Then came Melissa Grant, the HOA president. She had one of those personalities that could smile while making unreasonable demands sound completely normal. Around the neighborhood, people admired her because she always appeared organized, confident, and determined. But after our first meeting, I realized something else entirely. Melissa wasn't looking for compromise. She simply assumed persistence would eventually wear people down. Every conversation followed the same pattern. She'd compliment my property, praise the natural beauty, then casually explain how removing the tree line would improve the view for dozens of families. She framed it like some noble community improvement project instead of asking one landowner to sacrifice permanent protection for someone else's backyard scenery. I politely declined every single time. I explained the environmental purpose of the trees, the erosion risks, the wind protection, and the fact that they stood entirely on my property. I even showed copies of surveys proving the boundary. I figured once she saw official documentation, the discussion would end. Instead, it only seemed to convince her that I was being difficult. That's the strange part about some people. Evidence doesn't change their opinion. It just makes them believe you're standing in the way of what they already deserve. Over the next several weeks, strange things started happening around the property line. Survey flags disappeared overnight. Fresh tire tracks appeared near the trees after weekends when construction crews weren't supposed to be working. A few lower branches had been cut without permission. Nothing major, just enough to make me wonder whether someone was testing how closely I paid attention. I installed a few trail cameras facing the western boundary, mostly because my gut kept telling me the situation wasn't finished. Looking back, that decision turned out to be one of the smartest things I ever did. Meanwhile, the HOA meetings became increasingly hostile, at least according to neighbors who weren't afraid to quietly share what they were hearing. Melissa reportedly displayed aerial photos of my property during one meeting and argued that the tree lines served no meaningful purpose anymore. Some homeowners questioned whether the association even had authority over land outside the subdivision, but those voices were quickly drowned out by residents obsessed with improving their view. For it's unbelievable how quickly common sense disappears when people start imagining higher home values. Then contractors began appearing around the subdivision, working on landscaping upgrades near the shared boundary. Massive bulldozers, excavators, and heavy equipment rolled in almost daily. Officially, they were expanding walking trails and improving drainage inside the neighborhood. At least that's what everyone was told. But every afternoon those machines parked closer and closer to my tree line. I noticed workers measuring distances while staring toward my property instead of theirs. One morning I even found fresh orange paint markings sprayed suspiciously close to my fence posts. That was the moment my instincts shifted from concern to genuine suspicion. Something bigger was being planned behind closed doors, and whatever it was, it centered on those cedar trees. I still hoped I was overthinking everything because surely no professional contractor would cross a clearly marked property boundary. That would be reckless, expensive, and impossible to justify. But as the equipment kept gathering just beyond the fence and Melissa suddenly stopped contacting me altogether, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. The silence felt wrong. Sometimes the loudest warning isn't another threat. It's when the people making demands suddenly stop asking altogether. And I was about to learn exactly why. The morning everything changed looked almost peaceful. I was finishing breakfast when the distant rumble of heavy machinery echoed across the valley. At first I assumed the subdivision was continuing its trail project, but something felt off. The engines kept getting closer, and then one of my trail camera notifications appeared on my phone. I opened it expecting to see wildlife. Instead, I watched a bulldozer sitting just inside my property line with workers positioning themselves along the cedar trees. My heart dropped. Bro, I genuinely couldn't believe what I was seeing. They weren't inspecting the trees or trimming branches. They were preparing to remove the entire windbreak as if they owned the land. By the time I reached the western boundary, several massive cedars were already crashing into the ground. Decades of growth disappeared within minutes, leaving nothing but broken trunks, exposed soil, and clouds of dust hanging in the air. The operators continued working with complete confidence, apparently convinced they had every right to be there. What shocked me even more was how several HOA board members stood nearby watching the destruction like they were celebrating a neighborhood improvement project. That afternoon, I documented everything, contacted the county, and secured every piece of evidence from my cameras. Deep down, though, I knew the missing trees were only the beginning. The valley had just lost its natural shield, and nature always collects its debt. The county inspectors arrived faster than I expected, and the moment they compared my recorded property survey with the fresh bulldozer tracks, the mood changed completely. What had been presented as a simple landscaping project suddenly looked like unauthorized destruction of private property. Work crews were ordered to stop immediately, and the contractors began distancing themselves from the HOA, explaining they had been told the entire area had already been approved for clearing. Meanwhile, Melissa and several board members insisted everything had been done for the benefit of the community. Hearing that honestly blew my mind because the exposed hillside behind them was already proving why those cedars had existed for decades. Only a few days later, the weather delivered the kind of windstorm locals expected every summer. Normally, the cedar barrier would slow those powerful gusts before they reached the subdivision. This time, there was nothing standing in their way. Six wind raced across the open fields, lifting loose topsoil into massive rolling clouds that slammed directly into the luxury homes that had demanded a better view. Within hours, patios disappeared beneath layers of dust, gardens were buried, outdoor furniture was scattered across yards, and visibility dropped so badly that several streets became difficult to drive through. It looked less like a quiet neighborhood and more like the edge of a desert storm. The irony was impossible to ignore. The very view everyone wanted had vanished behind a thick wall of blowing dirt. Expensive windows needed constant cleaning, air filters clogged, landscaping suffered, and homeowners who had applauded the tree removal were suddenly demanding emergency action. Bro, this part was unbelievable. The same people who had dismissed the trees as an eyesore were now asking experts how to recreate the protection they had destroyed. The estimates to restore the damaged land and establish a new windbreak reached staggering numbers, far beyond what anyone had imagined when this all began. Karma didn't arrive with anger, it arrived with the wind. The legal aftermath lasted months, but the outcome was impossible to ignore. County officials confirmed the tree line had been removed without my authorization, and responsibility ultimately fell on those who had approved the project. Between property damage, restoration costs, and contractor disputes, the HOA faced financial consequences that far exceeded the cost of simply respecting a property boundary in the first place. As for my land, restoration began with conservation experts helping stabilize the exposed soil while new trees were planted for future generations. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was a reminder that shortcuts often create bigger problems than they solve. Looking back, this story was never really about trees. It was about what happens when entitlement collides with reality. 7 Bro, the moment they chose a prettier view over common sense, the consequences became inevitable. Nature doesn't care about HOA votes, it simply follows its own rules. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, who do you think was most responsible for everything that happened?